Indeed. Good evening, everybody. My name's Sophie Lieberman. I'm Head of Programs here at Sydney Living Museums, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Mint this evening. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'm very excited to be able to welcome you to the last of our Sydney Open Talks series, Rooms in the House, this evening. In the last 7 weeks, we've been on a journey through the intimate spaces in which we live, from the splendour of the 19th century dining room to the domesticity meets design of the modern kitchen. We've discovered the delights of the bed and its room, and seen a glimpse of a more compact way of living in the modern Japan-inspired living room of only 38 square metres. Glimpsing our rooms through both the modern and a contemporary lens, running themes have emerged about how our changing gender roles in the public sphere have shifted the spaces in our private homes. We've been able to note the fundamental changes that modernist architecture has made to our expectations of our homes and of our families, and also how the Australian environment has impacted on every space in our lives. We've been fortunate to be joined by old friends like Howard Tanner, Judith O'Callaghan and Hannah Tribe, to name a few, and also welcome new ones to our work with Rebecca Huntley, Anthony Gill and Koichi Takada. Most rewardingly, we've been able to hear from our talented staff, the curators Joanna Nicholas, Scott Hill, Michael Leck, and Assistant Director of Heritage, Ian Innes. Tonight we turn to those other rooms, and despite what may appear to be a limited suite of options when it comes to deciding what is in and what is out in a series of 8 talks about rooms in the house, there are actually a lot of grey areas. What do you do with the laundry? Where does the pool room fit? How about the corridor? Is a corridor even a room? Maybe it's a problem peculiar to this institution, but we spent quite a lot of time thinking about it. Here at the end of the series, we try to respond to this conundrum, and continuing on our tradition of providing a historical and a contemporary perspective on each space, and of welcoming both family and new friends to share their insights, we have 2 speakers taking up the challenge, Megan Martin and Mike Scott. As per the previous sessions, each will present for 30 minutes and we'll take questions at the end. We are also recording this session, so if you can refrain from taking photographs, that would be fantastic. And also if you could switch your phones once more to silent. So on to the business of the evening. I'm delighted to be able to welcome our first speaker, our dear colleague Megan Martin, who is the Head of Collections and Access at Sydney Living Museums. She's responsible for developing a specialist collection of publications and documentary materials relating to the history of houses, domestic interiors and gardens in New South Wales, and it has been at the generosity of Megan and her team that we've been fortunate to be able to open the library for some of the sessions in this series. Megan.
Sorry, a bit creaky. Okay, as you can see from the title slide here, I'm going to talk about quite a few different rooms, although not the corridor. It'll be a fairly rapid cook's tour of these spaces, and then, if there's time, I'll wrap up with a few observations about why we no longer have these rooms generally, and invite you to think a bit about how we've replaced the functions. So the rooms that I'm going to talk about tonight are rooms that presume a level of wealth and prosperity and large houses. So they're a far cry from the house in this photograph. The Kotzer family farmhouse near Henty in southwest New South Wales around 1904. It's quite modest, but they don't seem unhappy, this little household. I'm going to start with boudoirs. And this little sketch provides a child's eye view of the boudoir, a private sitting room for the lady of the house. Nothing to do with any salacious ideas of bedrooms. And in fact, one 19th century architectural writer suggested that the name boudoir came from the French verb boudoir, to pout, and that in French houses the very commendable purpose of the room was to allow ill humour to be got rid of in private. English ladies, of course, more phlegmatic, use this private space to settle their household accounts and for reading, music, sewing or worsted work. Edith Wharton, in an influential book on the decoration of houses published in 1898, saw the French origins of the room in a different way. She mourned the passing of the 18th century boudoir, used by ladies to read and write poetry or love letters, and perhaps to cry over lost love. She suggested that by 1898 the boudoir was generally used for the prosaic purpose of interviewing servants and going over accounts. However, it could still be furnished in a delicate style, and she recommended that since the boudoir was generally a small room, it was particularly suited to more delicate styles of painting or decoration, and small objects of art and all manner of delicate effects in wood carving or marquetry and other ornamentation came into their own in the boudoir. And this is Mrs. Thomas Mort's boudoir at Greenoaks and Darling Point, with all the accoutrements generally expected in such a room: a day bed, a bookcase, even a writing desk you can see in the back of the photograph in that little alcove. This is a house which still exists, but it's now called Bishop's Court, and actually it's currently on the market for 25 million plus. The rooms are all still there. Some of them, there's images of some of them in the real estate pages on the web. This is another boudoir. This is not much evidence of reading or writing in this one, or at least what we can see of the room in this photograph. Kyoto was a large house in Botany Street, Waverley, demolished in the early 60s. And in the early 20th century, it was the home of Edmund Playfair and his family. Playfair owned a shipping providore company, and his wife Edith was the daughter of a sea captain and a notable Sydney hostess. There are other rooms identified as boudoirs in Australian houses around this time, including one at Coombe Cottage in Melbourne, Dame Nellie Melba's house. Now I'm going to move on to smoking rooms. They're naturally, you might expect, a masculine space. And in England, the smoking room was really a phenomenon of the second half of the 19th century. Perhaps influenced, some say, by Queen Victoria's belief that smoking was an unsavoury habit and should not be indulged in polite company. Although some of the princesses snuck down the back of the garden, it seems. But anyway, Robert Kerr, who was an architect and author of a book called The Gentleman's House, published in London in 1864, sold in Australia and owned by several people in Australia, was a very influential and long-lasting guide to house planning. He explained that some gentlemen were driven to pitiable lengths, even in their own houses, in order to be able to enjoy the pestiferous luxury of a cigar. This state of affairs, he said, had given rise to the occasional introduction of an apartment specifically dedicated to the use of tobacco. And in 1880, one architectural writer had theorised the problem, suggesting that one of the reasons for making a special smoking room in English houses, as opposed to the continent, which is a bit more decadent, was the dampness of the English climate, which retained the smell of stale tobacco more readily than a dry climate. I'm sure many of you will think nothing's changed, actually. My 1880 source, an architect named Stevenson, who published a 2-volume manual of house planning, said that in some households the billiard room could serve the purpose of a smoking room, and sometimes the library was used, but it was not without inconvenience, for the library might be wanted by those who disliked smoking, and books were apt to retain the smell of stale tobacco. So by the late 1880s, the smoking room had become the gentleman's special retiring room and was designed as a place of exotic luxury, often decorated in a Moorish style, as you see here. And in fact, this illustration comes from a book on ornamental interiors published in 1887 by J. Moyer Smith. And it discusses a fashion then current for decorators to fit up smoking rooms in the Oriental style, particularly using materials from the London retailer Liberty and Company, who imported something called Mush Araby lattice work from Egypt. And other furnishers imported the whole fronts of old houses from Cairo, which were used to make latticework screens and oriental arches and Damascus niches. And if you think this is all a bit exotic for Sydney, or that we're a bit too uncouth, Then we have this example from Swifts, which is a house that still stands in Darling Point. Some of you may have been there. It's a 56-room mansion built for the Tooth Brewing family in the 1880s. And on the left of the slide, you see the smoking room as restored by Clive Lucas, Stapleton and Partners, and published in Sunday Telegraph. And on the right hand, you see a photograph of that smoking room called the Moorish Room, when it's been cleaned out and before that restoration begins. And you can see that there's that lattice work there that might have even come from one of those old Cairo shop fronts. The Tooths may well have been shopping in London for the house, and I'm pretty certain that it didn't come from Goodlett and Smith's yard down at Darling Harbour. Now, I began by saying that the smoking room was a phenomenon of the second half of the 19th century, but by the end of that century, Edith Wharton was suggesting that the smoking room proper, with its mise-en-scène of Turkish divans, nargilahs, brass coffee trays and other oriental effects, is no longer considered a necessity of the modern house, and the room which would have been formerly used for this special purpose now comes rather under the head of the master's lounging room or den, since the latter word seems to have attained the dignity of a technical term. Now, Edith Wharton was an American, very influential American decorator, but a book was published in London and sold in Sydney. So den we seem to have got from her, well, from the Americans. So you see that even though she said it was on its way out, the idea didn't disappear entirely, as you can see from these two schemes in a wallpaper company's trade catalogue from the 1920s. One of the rooms is described as a smoking room and the other as a man's business room or smoke room. Now I'm going to move away for the moment from the private apartments for the gentleman or the lady of the house to consider special entertaining rooms, starting with the ballroom. Robert Kerr, my source from 1864, tells us that the ballroom seldom occurred except in palatial houses, and that a proper ballroom will be a spacious apartment entirely unfurnished except for seats and ornaments, the whole central area being vacant and couches or chairs placed around the walls. It might include a gallery to allow for an orchestra, as well as a banquette or platform raised 1 or 2 steps from the floor and arranged around the wall for seats, to elevate the spectators sufficiently for a view of the dancers. Now, some of you will know this ballroom at Government House in Sydney. There is a whole stage for the orchestra at the other end of the ballroom, and then you can see that nice little alcove for the viewing of the dancers. Kerr also acknowledges, though, that the term ballroom was often used in a colloquial way to refer to a supplementary drawing room, planned and furnished with an eye generally to the purposes of dancing. And we can see an example of this use in this sketchbook drawing of Mrs. Hurst dancing. It's obviously an exhausting business, as 2 of the ladies are fanning themselves after their exertions, and the gentleman's looking at his watch, I think wondering what time he might retire. And that's, I think, Mrs. Hurst off there dancing by herself. There are plenty of examples of ballrooms in 19th century private houses in Australia. This is a pre-demolition photograph of the ballroom at Burdekin House, which once stood just down the road in Macquarie Street, where St Stephen's Church is now. The space was actually probably not a full-time ballroom. It could be divided into 2 rooms, furnished as drawing rooms, and then cleared to work as a ballroom. But there were other grand ballrooms in Sydney and in country New South Wales. The ballroom at Swifts, apparently, was larger than the Government House ballroom, and there was a 70 by 50 foot ballroom at Duckenfield Park House, a 45-room mansion built by wealthy pastoralist John Eales near Morpeth. And that ballroom had a sprung floor and a musician's gallery. And this ballroom at Chatsworth in Potts Point, though not particularly large, was very grand in terms of decoration. And it was quite a match to Edith Wharton's prescription for furnishing a ballroom. She recommended that a panelling of mirrors forms a brilliant ballroom decoration, and in ballrooms of great size and importance, where the walls demand a more architectural treatment, the use of an order, she means a classical architectural order, naturally suggests itself, pilasters of marble, separated by marble niches containing statues, form a severe but splendid decoration. And if white and coloured marbles are combined and the whole is surmounted by a domed ceiling frescoed in bright colours, the effect is extremely brilliant. And the Chatsworth Ballroom ticked a lot of those boxes. It had a frescoed ceiling and other painted decorations around the walls, including the Four Seasons shown here beneath the musician's balcony. There were 9 mirrors extending from floor to ceiling around the room, with ventilators beneath each mirror. There were Corinthian columns picked out in white and gold on either side of the mirrors, and there was a polished parquetry floor which could render, it was said, dancing as nearly floating as may be. And we have quite a few of the original drawings for these frescoes in our collection here. Now, Eatham at Darling Point was another house with a famous ballroom. It was a grand house built in 1869 for James Sutherland Mitchell, who was a partner in the Tooth Brewery. The original ballroom was enclosed with glass on both the northeast and the south sides and had a frontage overlooking Double Bay. The ballroom was enlarged after this photograph was taken to nearly twice that original size. And it had a reputation in the day. To go to an entertainment at Eatham wasn't the ambition of all in the social world, it was said. And a gentleman in 1891 named Mann published a piece of music called the Eatham Waltz, dedicated to Mrs. Mitchell. And in this slide you can see part of the enlarged ballroom, but it's a bit pale, I know, but something's happened. It's now got a drawing room setting marooned down one end of the dance floor. This is something that Edith Wharton warned against. She said that the European tradition was that gala rooms like the ballroom should be used exclusively for entertaining and should be quite separate from the family apartments. They were different kinds of rooms designed for essentially different phases of life. I think we might assume that that phase of life is about the marriage market and marrying off your daughters. Gala rooms were meant for general entertainments where the crowd takes the place of furniture. So those conditions, she said, unfit the gala room for any use save for that for which it is designed. James Mitchell died in 1893 and Eatham was sold and its days of glittering balls came to an end. The room was turned into an exotic oriental room by its new owner, full of collections of lacquerwork, Boer War medals, relics from the Russian-Japanese War, pictures and other art treasures. It became a gallery, really, or possibly a den. This is Eatham on the cover of the sheet music published in 1891. The ballroom is the pavilion overlooking the harbour, and the smaller glass-walled room on the side is probably the conservatory. The other piece of sheet music for the Go-Cup Polka Mazurka was published in September 1861 and dedicated to Mrs. Archer Broughton. Go-Cup was the Broughton property near Tumut, and the mazurka in this case was probably paid at a ball in the woolshed. The music room. Grand houses often also had a music room, and our guide to these rooms, Edith Wharton, specified that the first rule to be observed in their decoration was the avoidance of all stuff hangings, draperies, and substances likely to deaden sound. She also suggested that because guests remained seated in a music room and everything in the room could be subjected to close and prolonged scrutiny, then the walls of a music room were especially suited to a more fanciful style of decoration. And there was plenty to scrutinise in Mrs. Playfair's music room at Kyoto. Although she does seem to have breached that first rule of decoration, the avoidance of draperies likely to deaden sound. But you can, if you look hard, see that there is a piano in this room, and there may have been other instruments at some time. Now, it seems likely that for most households the music room was a step too far in terms of both accomplishments and entertainments, although I've found other photographs of rooms designated as music rooms in Australian houses at this time, and of course there was one at Coombe Cottage, Dame Nellie Melba's house. But much more general was the playing of music, especially playing the piano with vocal accompaniment. And at an intimate gathering of family and friends, this social activity was usually accommodated in the drawing room, even a small drawing room like this one at Marugal. And we know that this house, was full of music and singing in its heyday. Libraries and studies. these could be two separate rooms or could have their functions combined. And in the 19th century, they were generally assumed to be gentlemen's rooms. Our man Robert Kerr explained that in the average gentleman's house, the family's collection of books will form the chief furniture of the library, but he said that the room was not a library in the sole sense of a depository for books. Rather, it was a sort of morning room for gentlemen where their correspondence was done and their reading and sometimes their lounging. In a small house for a studious man, for example, a parsonage, and this is a parsonage in this slide, the library and the study were one and the same, and the library was the parson's private room. Kerr suggested that in such cases, a bookcase of light reading would generally be placed in the dining room or drawing room. We can see from this slide of the Camden Park Library in 1854 that the studious members of this household were both male and female. Note the sets of bound volumes. When James MacArthur married Emily Stone in 1838, he commissioned an agent in London to draw up a long list of suitable titles for a gentleman's library, and that list survives at Camden Park. This is the library as sitting room, or sitting room as library, although those of you who've been to a Camden Park open day may know that there's also a special purpose-built book passage linking this room to the dining room at Camden Park. The other type of studious man, it's a type, in the 19th century was the gentleman scientist. And if you go to Elizabeth Bay House today, you will see this room furnished to interpret the scientific interests of the Macleay men. But it's lost its fitted cedar bookshelves. The photograph was taken just at the time that the house was being turned into a wedding reception venue, and the bookcases were about to be stripped out to convert this room into a ballroom. And at Elizabeth Bay House today, I would say that the space is presented more as a study than a library. Now, you could have a study without a library, and the study was definitely a masculine room in this case. And it seems to have been a gendered space with a remarkable capacity to survive. So the image on the left is a mantelpiece in the study at a Coral Bingley, and it's an unusual record of a gentleman squatter's life in the remote outback of South Australia in the last quarter of the 19th century. This squatter probably called his room a study because it equated to a room with that function in the family seat Toft Hall in Cheshire. Undoubtedly, the occupant, Mr. Lester, used the room to read and write letters, to do his accounts, and to read novels and newspapers. It was probably also his smoking room, and Edith Wharton might have looked at his perfectly arranged mantelpiece with the guns and the dress sword, a memento of Lester's earlier career as a naval officer, and said it was a den. The other image is an exhibition room. It's one of the modern rooms in the Burdekin House exhibition held in 1929. And I put it in there because it tells us that as late as that 1929, the idea of the gendered room was alive and well. Conservatories. In September 1826, John MacArthur wrote to his son Edward from Elizabeth Farm describing the remodelling of the house that was then underway. We are occupying the old drawing room, adjoining to which is a pretty conservatory or plant room 9 feet square. There was a matching plant room at the other end of the veranda off the dining room. Now, these rooms were not technically conservatories in the English architectural sense of a glass-framed room, and they had casement windows and French doors. But a conservatory could take various forms, and it could be the glazed end of a veranda, it could open off a room of the house, or it could be a freestanding structure. It had a horticultural purpose, but it was also an extension of the living space. And here you could show off your prized horticultural specimens, or your eligible daughters, or even conduct a dalliance on the pretence of inspecting the orchids. The heyday of the English conservatory as an architectural space was the second half of the 19th century, and there are many examples of grand conservatories built in Australia at this time, including this one at St Monans at Elizabeth Bay, built on the edge of the harbour. Now, it was a freestanding conservatory. But in this slide, the conservatory is attached, and you can see if you look closely, you can see the potted plants arrayed around inside the windowsill, as we saw in that earlier photograph from Entally. Our friend Robert Kerr suggested that it was common to connect a conservatory with either the drawing room or boudoir or morning room, but a better connection was with a saloon, a vestibule, a gallery or a corridor, immediately joining one of those rooms. And he said an outer door to the grounds was, of course, indispensable. I'm not quite certain why, but someone here may know, but you can see that there is one in this picture. Maybe it was for the gardener to get in without going through the house. Kerr warned, though, that it must never be lost sight of that to attach a conservatory too directly to any dwelling room is inadvisable. The warm, moist air, impregnated with vegetable matter and deteriorated by the organic action of the plants, is both unfit to breathe and destructive of the fabrics of furniture and decoration. Now, theoretically, there was a distinction between a greenhouse and a conservatory, one more horticultural and one more ornamental. But this distinction was often lost in Australian climates, where the bush house might take the role of the greenhouse, and the veranda might take on some of the social and ornamental roles of the conservatory, especially the use of a plant stage, which Ian Innes talked about when he was talking about verandas. Come now to billiard rooms. It's another masculine stronghold. You might have seen a recent episode of Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries where Phryne Fisher and her pals, all wearing trousers, were playing billiards. The subtext was clearly that this was a transgressive activity for women. I actually think the billiard room in this photograph is a bit too ordinary perhaps for Phryne, but billiard rooms were numerous and varied. And the architectural writer Stevenson, who I mentioned when I was talking about the smoking room, laid out the requirements in his book published in 1880. He said, "A billiard room is an essential of most country houses as a means of killing time on wet days. Its position should be retired so that men may be at their ease in it smoking and playing in their shirt sleeves and to drown the knocking of the balls. The neighbourhood of the dining room and butler's pantry is convenient. It should, if possible, have a roof light, but as well also to have a window for those not playing to look out from, which is best if a bay window or recess. When lit by windows in the walls, they should be high and, if possible, on more than one side to prevent the balls casting shadows, which makes an accurate stroke difficult. See, it's very important to get the technical details right. Seats on a raised platform so as to command the table are placed for onlookers. Sometimes a billiard table is placed in the hall, where it's convenient for a pastime and for ladies joining in the game. Its brown holland cover, though, when unused, is out of place in what is usually one of the handsomest apartments of the house. But there's no necessity why the cover should not be of some more ornamental stuff. To regular players, however, this arrangement is not satisfactory. It renders smoking impossible, while the exposure to every caller prevents playing in shirt sleeves. In the previous slide, and in this, you can see that sometimes the competition for space between male and female requirements in the household could mean that one end of the billiard room might be furnished as a sitting room. And this house, Kuanu in Kissing Point Road, Turramurra, was built for William James Adams, the heir to the Tattersall's fortune. It later became a genteel boarding house. This is the billiard room at Brooksby in Double Bay. Actually, I'm not certain that Mr. Little, who I presume that is reclining on one of the sofas, and who was the owner of the house, I'm not certain that he's a really serious billiards player because the lighting of above the table doesn't really seem up to scratch. But his trophies are, there's this animal under the billiard table, if you look, and there's antlers to the left, and there's bison horns above the pelmet at the other end of the room. I think you could say that this is definitely the billiard room as den. And it's a classy den. There's bronzes and busts, as well as the trophies. So a few final thoughts on dens. The idea of the den has come up throughout the talk, and it's been defined as a man's room. And I've already covered along the way most of the functions, but this slide illustrates one other use, and possibly one closest to the function that I think is sometimes meant when people talk about a man cave. A trophy room, a room for collections of a certain masculine character, although I expect our second speaker will explain this better. The cabin was a room in Kyoto, in Waverley, and you might remember that this was a house owned by a family with shipping connections, which explains a lot about what we're seeing in that room. Now, I've included this slide because it shows a mid-century modern room, although it's called a man's den. So if we say that an overriding principle of planning in the 19th century middle-class house was a differentiation of function, the allocation of a separate room for each function, and the designation of functions by gender and class, then we see that the middle-class Victorian house allocated various levels of convenience, space, privacy and importance to different members of the household according to their age, gender and status. So the lady of the house might have a boudoir, but her daughters didn't have those spaces. In the 20th century, even from the early days of the century, there were profound changes in that household, influenced in part by struggles for women's emancipation, especially the struggle for economic independence and the right to work. And women were no longer the angel in the house. That was the ideal in the 19th century. By the 20th century, their role was no longer to have the dinner on the table and the slippers by the fireside, etc., when the breadwinner came home. And children were no longer seen and not heard. And most households became servantless. In more recent times, households are also increasingly singular, and more homes might be apartments, not houses. Add all this to modernism's embrace of open plan living, and it spells the deaths of the other rooms that I've been talking about. And I just want to say, though, I think there's nothing particularly masculine in this room, notwithstanding its name, but it does remind us that there was a real drive in the 50s to push women back into the house after the war. Now, my final slide. As I've talked about these rooms, you'll have noticed that there's sometimes been a bit of slippage between them. The smoking room into the billiard room, the ballroom into the drawing room, the music room into the drawing room, the library into the sitting room. And the smoking room and the billiard room both slip into the den. And the slippage is not just about how many rooms you have in the house. Consider this cartoon. It's from a Sydney Morning Herald June this year, and it's really a heckler column about the problem of finding house room for a family heirloom that is no longer able to be tuned. But the cartoon says it all. I might say I think they're tuning forks, not eating forks, on the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Megan. I told you we take our rooms very seriously here at Sydney Living Museums. Our next speaker this evening is Mike Scott, and Mike has 30 years of experience working in the development industry as a home builder, a designer, a real estate agent, a developer and a consultant. He was a member of the executive teams at Divine Limited and also at Urban Pacific Limited. He currently works as a consultant and has provided advice and management services to governments, investors, developers and home builders, which includes the delivery of more than 1,500 dwellings in Landcom's stimulus social housing and also the ACT government's Land Development Agency's Own Place programs. Mike is a past president and life member of the Urban Development Institute of Australia, New South Wales Division and the National UDIA, and he's going to speak to us this evening about the last 20 to 40 years of home building. Please welcome Mike.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to come along and say a few things. It's been a great series. I've had the pleasure of looking online at most of the talks that we've had so far, and I think it's been very thought-provoking. And the idea of the historical and then the contemporary is certainly an interesting way to position the discussion and the questions that come later. I really want to focus on project homes because although in Sydney 30% of housing is detached homes and 70% is multi-unit these days because we're focusing on trying to keep the footprint of the city smaller, the other speakers such as Anthony Gill and Koshi Takada have talked about apartments, particularly that fantastic 38 square metre one-bedder or single room apartment that he was living in. So I thought it would be timely to talk about cottages and talk about detached homes and talk about project homes, the rise of and how baby boomers really drove the consumption era and project homes, the rise and fall of the McMansion, and some people will be happy to hear that I believe it's fallen. Others may be disappointed. The ageing boomers and the boomerangs, which of course are their kids that never quite move out. The 21st, and look at some 21st century living ideas, and then the future of other rooms. So project homes and baby boomers. I suppose the origins of the project home are interesting, and it's been a topic that certainly Judith O'Callaghan talked about, and she's got a great book that you'll see the cover of up on the screen very shortly. But after the post-war era, we had enormous growth, of course, in Australia, particularly in Sydney. The arrival of the car-dependent suburbs, freedom, you can drive and get around. And we saw the emergence of the display village, where people could go and buy a home off the rack, off the hook, and put it on their own block. This emergence of designer suburbs, where architects started, name architects, Robin Boyd, started working in this area of project homes and affordable housing for average families, which was a great thing. And it really started with small, modest homes on large blocks, because we were free to drive and get out, and it was the garden suburb meets the modernist meets the sort of prairie style. There was all this stuff sort of washing around at the time. And so we came up with the project home. And then we saw the participation rate in employment rise. We saw the two-car family start to come in the 70s, and boomers and the consumer age. And all of a sudden we got to the 1980s, and I think it sort of took over from there. This is the book Designer Suburbs. I commend it to you to have a look at, but it talks about architects and their influence on early project homes, and talks about Pettit and Sevitt. And as you can see, the first of the project homes was quite modest. 3-bedroom, combined living, dining, or there's a wall there, a zoning living, dining, but dining through to the kitchen. There's not many other rooms there. So really housing for the average person is still fairly modest. And I think the point that Megan made is you need some prosperity, you need some... and Howard Tanner talked about that, the last 20 years of prosperity, what effect has it had on housing? I think that's a point he raised. And really you need prosperity to have all these discretionary rooms, because the other rooms are the essential rooms, the discretionary rooms you need to be able to afford. So the rise and fall of the McMansion, the first part of that I'll talk about is the rise, the era of 1987, as I put it, to 1995. This was other rooms for everyone. Now we've got affordable housing, you can all have those other rooms. We got hit by the tsunami of move-up baby boomers. Of course, by 1987, the first of the baby boomers were just hitting 40, early 40s, and the last of them were in their mid-20s or late 20s. So they're starting to get teenage kids arriving and small families. They want a bigger home. So we saw innovation in construction, raft slabs, prefab frames, pre-made windows, kitchen cabinetry that was all pre-ordered, and this drove a lot of cost out of the production of housing, veneer construction. So as a result, it was pretty affordable. Per square metre, housing was reasonably affordable. They invented the progress payment system with construction loans, which meant the developer didn't have to actually fund the construction of the house anymore, it was being funded by the purchasers. So homes started to get bigger. And this is really where we saw the move of the big 2-storey homes starting to come into play in Sydney. The entry was the first other room, really. At the front of these with a grand set of stairs inside and up to the bedrooms, kids' bedrooms upstairs. And Homeworld was born, the sort of showroom of the industry where you can go out and look at 1,000 ideas and 1,000 houses. And it was the time of the bicentennial. And the bicentennial gave rise to Mock Federation. If I had to paint another house cream and Brunswick green, I was going to throw up, I think. And I've called it Fediterranean because it sort of started to breed its own style. So the homes were across sort of 20-metre frontage blocks. Clarendon Homes probably one of the most notable producers of it. And it was all still about the front of house. It was still about formal rooms. If you went into those homes, you went into an entry foyer. There was a formal living room with a dining room at the back that often went through to a kitchen. Might have been a study on the right. And you went through to a fairly modest family room adjacent to the kitchen. It was only small, and there was an optional rumpus on the back that you could normally have. Home was across the block, and then the backyard was sort of 20 metres by 20 metres, a good-sized backyard, probably a 700 or 800 square metre block. So it's sort of a big house on a big block. We saw garages. We bought the garage, of course, the car inside. The car was one of those great possessions that we needed to protect and look after, so let's bring it inside. Entries, formal rooms and studies. And this big formal space, but quite a relatively small informal space. Then we had the recession we had to have. The housing industry got fairly tight, as a lot of industries did. And government started to think about debt. A lot of state governments had racked up debt and they started to think about debt. We had the Rogernomics, economic rationalism. I'm sure we remember all those sayings and all of those things, which we hear now as a good thing because Australia's public debt is much lower than many other countries. We keep hearing that quoted to us, although I hear the ceiling's going to 500 billion, so I'd hate to hear it if we really had some debt. So low government debt, and that's because they started to say, well, we're not going to just keep servicing these suburbs. They're big, dispersed, lots of services in the ground. They cost a lot of money to produce and it's coming out of the public purse. So there's an example of the homes that go across the block and fairly large. The triple garage started to come into play and very interesting. We then got to the boom period, which is 95 to 2003, and we're after now the recession we had to have, but we've been told by government we need to make the suburbs a bit more dense. We need to make more use of our land. Quite a reasonable proposition, really. But the work of Peter Newman and Ken Worthy in West Australia looked at densities of populations to make transport work, and public buses weren't working because the density wasn't enough. And it was landed on this idea that 15 dwellings per hectare gave you about 50 people per hectare. That started to make transport viable. So the 450 square metre block became the new norm. So now we've got small blocks with government planning policy, but big houses, and the boomers' families are getting bigger, and they've now got teenage kids. So the value offer, was all about the consumption period and supersizing, and box on box. A company called Hanley arrived in Sydney with a house that was just a 2-storey, but you'll see them in a minute, and it was small lots and big houses all of a sudden. The house started to go down the block, the backyard basically disappeared. Lots of debate about whether that's a good thing or not, because with land prices, 400 square metres in a backyard means you're paying off a couple of $100,000 over 20 years to own that space if it's only used for a few years. So lots of discussion. But people certainly started to value the space in the house more than the block of land. We started to have big formal spaces and big informal spaces. Now we've got teenage kids, they want a rumpus room, they want room at the back, but we couldn't get off the idea of the formal rooms at the front. And parents' retreats started to come in, this escape, these other rooms of, luxurious baths that you could sit in with a bottle of champagne, and, there was always, all the display homes had a picture of Robert Redford on the wall in the bathroom. And teenagers upstairs with their own study rooms and all of this space. Sydney 2000 and Newington, I think, was an interesting period because we started to actually see some modern architectural forms return to new housing. Contemporary looking houses and sort of got rid of the Mediterranean, and quality started to come into play again. So that's the, I suppose, the boom there. That's the eaves are clipped off to keep the houses fairly affordable. And there's a lot of reaction to that, and questions started to be raised about the quality of design. 2003 to 2013 I've called the fall of the McMansion. This is where we saw two concepts really rise and change houses. The outdoor room, Jamie Jury, the TV show, everyone was outdoors entertaining. I remember going through a display home and someone's grandmother was there and she said, gee, I remember the days when we used to eat inside and go outside to go to the bathroom. Now we eat outside and come inside to go to the bathroom. So certainly changed the way we live. The big screen, sound system, surround sound. So formal spaces started to go. We finally got rid of the formal space, but the front room, there was this hook to a room at the front, which during the day you could have someone sit in and have a cup of tea, but the idea that you could use that as a media room, and that became it's become a bit of a joke that everyone's got a cinema room at the front, but really it was the loud room, I think, with the doors that you could shut that the kids could do games in with the booming sound system. Certainly that's in my place. The noisy room. So we got, in the other terms of other rooms, we've got kitchens, livings, dinings, and this al fresco room at the back, the fantastic al fresco room. And there's normally heaters out there, so you can sit out there in the cold and just sit inside. But anyway, everyone used to sit inside when they all smoked. Now no one smokes, we sit outside. But so anyway, informal, and it was all about the back of the house now, entertaining outside or in the kitchen. There's just examples of a couple of display homes of the cinema room and the outdoor entertaining area. As I said, the lots started to get smaller. We've now started to see builders saying, well, I need a range of homes. It's not just about these big homes. The houses are starting to get smaller. Modest single stories back. I suppose the most well-known builder at the moment, or the biggest builder in New South Wales, Eden Bray, has got a wide range of homes ranging from a 2-bedroom single story now of about 16 squares to a 4 or 5 bedroom with ensuite, 44 squares. Every room's got an ensuite. So if you've got the money and the 20-year-olds won't move out, that's fine, just turn your house into an apartment building. So there's all these growing home segments. So this is just an example of some of a small home at the moment that seems to be doing fairly well. It's fairly modest by current terms, 22 squares including the garage. There's a media room at the front, or a multi-room at the front as it's called, kitchen, living, dining at the back, a couple of bedrooms upstairs and a sort of sitting or study room. And it goes on a 225 square metre lot. So it's much more like the sort of scale of housing that you're seeing in the old inner suburbs in terms of block sizes and so on. Ageing boomers and their boomerangs. It's interesting just to put this snapshot of what's happened to the family car that was designed around the nuclear family. And when we lock into car plans that say that's the sort of car everyone's going to want to buy for the next 10 years, I think the diversity of cars that are now on the market and what people are looking for, this tells us a story about the car, but it's certainly relevant to talking about houses. McMansion's starting to lose their allure and the market is changing. So I said demand, housing industries followed the boomers for 30 years, 40 years, but now it's not all about the boomers. They're aged 52 to 67, they've done most of their growing. And interestingly, in 1979, about 1980, when this fad took over, the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act really allowed us to entrench monotype housing. So not much diversity, it's streets of big homes on big blocks. Boomers' kids should be starting to move out, but in fact in the last census, household sizes went up for the first time, and most of that's because of a rapid fall in home ownership in people in the under 35 age group. And another interesting statistic is boomers are starting to take mortgages into retirement. So downsizing boomers' kids, the boomerangs, investors, all now need to be considered because there's much more segments in the housing industry. So and affordability is the big issue. This is a graph just showing that was prepared prior to the Rudd government coming to power that just shows the changing in demographic there of the over 65s, the fact that they're going from 60,000 a year to 140,000 a year sort of growth each year, and the boomers' kids. Interesting, here's some stats from the National Housing Supply Council that the growth in couples without children and lone person households are going to actually constitute 70% or 75% of the growth of houses over the next 18 years. So pretty short time frames. And the boomer bubble is really in these growth areas where we've had these McMansions. Interestingly, that there, if you look at the growth in the age of 65, if you look at the Hills, Blacktown, Penrith, Liverpool, Camden and Campbelltown, they're going to average an increase in population of over 65s of about 200% in the next 18 years. So there's going to be a number of people wanting to downsize, and it'll be interesting to see what they downsize into because there's not much diversity in some of these outer areas. The Grattan Institute did a lot of good work, Jane Frances Kelly, on people wanting to trade off size for amenity and quality, and the next generation wanting to be near transport. If they love public transport because you can be connected when you're on a train. If you're driving, you can't be connected, and there's some interesting patterns emerging there. So looking at what's going to happen in the 21st century, the new project home, and I suppose this is what I've been working on, is trying to get project home builders to think about different things. The growth centres, this is talked about the Northwest and Southwest Growth Centre, and they've been planned around walkable neighbourhoods, circles and bus stops that feed to railway stations. So they've been planned to be very much more transport focused, and as you would have heard, the transport is going in, which is good, and that should support the ability to do more diverse housing and change the densities. So introducing housing diversity, it's about amenity and quality. It's not just about quantity, which has very much been what the offer's been about, affordability and size. It's about a range of housing types. I showed some small lots there on around 225. It's all about the reintroduction of terrace homes. We're starting to see those come back, and some small strata schemes. So this is an example of a project I've been working on in Penrith called Thornton, which is a bunch of project home builders. We're trying to retrain them on different housing types. The project is there. You see the old grid pattern, and there's a major park or oval in the middle, which is a historic oval. It's where Lord Sheffield played the first Sheffield Shield cricket game, and there you'll see Penrith Station there and Westfield on the other side of the station. So an excellently located old piece of defence land. and a good opportunity to sort of demonstrate some other options. So we've got different housing types. We needed to sort of say to the market, this, if you see it, you'll understand it, you might want to buy it. So we've demonstrated garden homes, patio homes, courtyard homes, terrace homes, and what we call garden and loft apartments, which are quite small-scale cottage-type apartments. We built this demonstration precinct of all these different housing types to show the market what was possible, and it's been pretty well received. So there's that demonstration precinct sitting out in the middle of the site, next to the oval. Terrace homes, as I said. There's this thing called the Fonzie flat, which is the apartment over the rear lane, the house that has over the garage at the rear lane. That's a house we're selling for $220,000, which is pretty affordable. It's a bed sitter. It's only about 40 square metres. There is no car space because you walk to the station. But it's been very interesting to see valuers and people try and get their head around it. But people have been camping to buy these sorts of houses. This is a patio home. It sits on a 170 square metre lot, but they're put on corners so that they've got sort of a wider view of the street and a bit more amenity. And you can see the rear lane there on the right-hand side. So this is how we're sort of arranging the end of the block next to amenity or riparian corridor or parks. We're sort of starting to introduce a laneway that goes through the block and some housing on the corners, these threeplexes, some terraces, and then that puts you back to on the left-hand side, the detached homes again. So starting to introduce diversity into neighbourhoods with triple cottages and strata units. This is an example of one of those corner units where there's a 3-car garage onto the rear lane. Over that 3-car garage is a 2-bedroom unit that is entered from the side street. And then at the front, there's a 2-bedroom unit on the ground floor entered from the front and a 2-bedroom unit entered from the side. You go up the stairs on the side and then there's your 2 bedrooms. So 3 2-bedroom units on a lot that's about 500 square metres. Not dissimilar to a lot of the housing types that we saw in the earlier suburbs around Sydney. It's a kind of reinvention of that. So what does all that mean for the future of those other rooms? Well, I think it's going to be about reuse, redevelopment and remodelling, about diversity. I think there's a wide range of new homes. Some will have big rooms, some will be big homes, some will have plenty of other rooms, some will be small homes. McMansions and the spare rooms is going to be very interesting, particularly I think the idea of intergenerational dwellings where you just can't quite get that last kid to move out. I got 4 and they're starting to hit their 20s. So how we pass this sort of asset bubble onto the kids, how we sort of reinvent some of these homes that are 30 and 40 squares. With all of those 20-year-olds there now, many of these places have got 4 drivers and lots of cars in the street, so I think actually changing the titling and reusing these buildings to multiple dwellings isn't going to make that great an impact on what's going on in the neighbourhood anyway. So adding rooms into big yards, some of those earlier project homes that were quite modest and had a big yard, we're starting to see that happen, and then compact homes close to transport and amenity. I think that the trends for me, the spare room will be about the 5 E's, entertainment, which is your media room or man cave. As I know a lot of people who the kids are moving out and they're saying, I've finally got a man cave, and I'm not sure what it is either. But it just seems to me to be a room where you can put your stuff and finally after 20 years no one touches it. So it sounds appealing even though I don't really know what it is. Education, obviously the library or the IT room, we're seeing IT nooks in kitchens now so you can observe younger kids doing homework and sort of have that as the sort of mission control of the house with the appointments and the sport on the weekends and, you know, Houston, I've got a problem, that sort of stuff. Enterprise, which is the home office, the gym, exercise and the extended family, as I already said. So the shed's coming inside because there's no point in having a proper shed anymore because you can't fix anything. You throw it away and get a new one. So the shed now is about, you know, having a beer and watching an old movie and doing that sort of stuff with your guys. So it comes inside. Adding other rooms in yards is a trend that we're seeing too with these granny flats and separate rooms being added into backyards. You can now add a 60 square metre granny flat to your house, I think, as of right, and there is a bit of this started going on. And then I think with smaller houses close to transport, we're going to sort of see these other rooms in a cupboard. You know, there's a kitchen and a study just as a bit of an example. So they're my thoughts on the topic. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. As promised, we went from smoking rooms to man caves, although I don't know that we quite know what a man cave is as yet. We have some time for questions. If you could keep an eye out for the microphones and please speak into them. We are recording this evening. Does anybody have any questions for Megan or Mike? Yeah, we've got one here, Ross.
Well, probably to both of you, Elizabeth Bay House famously was apartments for a large period of time before it came back to being Elizabeth Bay House and as it is now. When people want to redevelop something, Elizabeth Bay House was converted into flats. The big mansions, is there any thing in the Urban Development Institute where the government's getting out of people's pockets for transition costs to move from a large house to a small house? Because that seems to be a major impediment to people moving out of the house that they've paid off or nearly paid off to go to something more appropriate to their lifestyle needs.
Yes, certainly. If you want me to start, certainly they've been giving stamp duty concessions to people, I think, over 65 who want to buy off the plan. If they buy an apartment off the plan, I'm not sure if that's still running, but they will certainly look at incentivifying baby boomers to get out of the house, the big home, and get into something more small and more compact, so we don't keep building, 3 and 4 bedroom homes. I think there's certainly this feeling that once the kids start to leave home, isn't this great? We've finally got our space back and we've got all that room. But I think as the maintenance takes over and some of those things occur, then there's a second phase, which is I really need to move to something more compact. And at that point, it's about health issues and staying in their social network and trying to stay close to where they are. So I suppose the short answer is yes, they are certainly looking at incentives to get people to think about relocating, because there's going to be a big number all thinking about it at the same time, and you can't just produce the housing overnight.
Did we have another question? Yeah, just up the back here.
Megan mentioned earlier the laundry, and laundries are now rooms that are now in cupboards. I mean, my laundry is in a cupboard. But I've seen in sort of overseas decorating home type programs, the concept of having the actual laundry in the kitchen, which is not really a laundry, it's just really a washing machine or a dryer under a cupboard. Is that actually starting to come in Australia?
Well, certainly it is, particularly in apartments. Apartments, I think, can't remember which speaker, I think it might have been Anthony, talked about apartments just getting smaller and smaller, and the sort of combined washer-dryer that goes under the bench is something that's starting to come in, particularly if there's only 1 or 2 occupants.
So where do you actually put your laundry things in that type of arrangement? Because I know my cupboard is...
Find a spot.
Yeah. On the table.
Yes, on the piano. I think that's...
On the piano, yeah.
It's of course
when you've got 5 20-year-olds, it's all over the table. So now it's only over a little table.
Did we have any further questions?
What are you doing for the younger ones to move out? What are they going to move into?
Do you know what
I
that
think
question
that's what the diversity question's about, particularly in those outer areas where, in some of those suburbs, the suburbs ending with the word garden, hills or park, a lot of those suburbs, if you've been born and raised there and you want to live in that local area, there's just no options. I mean, I was born and raised in Ryde, and you bought a unit in Ryde, and you were sort of in the area where you had a house. So there was that diversity of housing in your local area. So I think I'm not pushing any particular agenda, but I think if we're going to see this thing where there's a transport footprint, if you're within a 500 or 600 or 800 metre walk of a decent T-way or a railway station, then I don't advocate masses of apartments, but cottage type scale that still protects overlooking, overshadowing, puts the parking on site into a 2 or 3 units, I think is something we've really got to seriously consider.
And of course, my dad. It's not a session without Dad asking a question.
Well, it's not actually a question, it's a statement. This person here said, I'm just coming over for the weekend, Dad, is that all right? Maybe she's going to move in.
No, I just wanted someone to do my laundry. on that happy note, did we have a question at the back? Or? Oh, Claire has a question. There we go.
So, Mike, can I ask, are there any cities that you think do housing well that are a good example that Sydney should follow?
I haven't really looked too extensively. I think we know what we're doing, and I think we've got our own way of figuring things out. So I wouldn't probably advocate looking for too many models elsewhere. But I think there's 1.5 million dwellings in Sydney and 4 million residents, and supposed to grow considerably. The answers are probably here already. So I'm sure there's good lessons, but I don't know of too many.
All right. Oh, one more. Sorry, Terry, I'll just pass you there.
It's sort of a comment and sort of a question, but what tonight I thought was fascinating. I think it was the best of the lot. It was fabulous. And the way the family works and the way that the house responds to the needs of the family has changed, and basically from a sort of the parents ruling in the older houses to the children ruling through the second half of the 20th century more and more and more. Do you think as parents, I'm a sort of very young of the baby boomers, I suppose. I've got a daughter who she wants to move out, but she can't afford to. So do you think the housing choices are going to stop responding so much to the needs of the children and the needs of the family and start responding again to the needs of the more mature people in the family? Do you think there's going to be a change in the trend? Or do you think we will continue to facilitate the needs of the children over the needs of the parents necessarily in housing choices?
Well, I think it's
important.
Yeah, it does make sense. It's important to remember too that Sydney's going from 4 million, I think, to 6 million, or is the sort of forecast, and a third of that's going to be from household sizes getting smaller, creating more. The 20-year-olds moving out and boomers downsizing. So there's 2 each time that happens. Obviously, a third from sort of natural growth, population growth, and a third sort of from immigration. So there's several sources. So even if we stopped immigration, this place is still going to grow quite considerably. But I think so. There will still be new bigger houses built. But the building industry doesn't have a lot of a research and development. Anyone can be a builder. It's difficult to get up the value tree. And it's been an industry in decline in the last 10 years. We now build in newer areas. We've been building 2,500 houses a year. When I started in the industry in 1980, it was about 8,000. So the industry's been in decline, which is why affordability is such an issue. But the housing industry will just always do what it did yesterday unless you try and train it to do it differently, which is what that project's been about. And interestingly, in that project with the terrace homes, we found 2 distinct buyer groups, being first home buyers who just want to get into the house. They want to get a house. They don't care if it's laminate kitchens and no skirting boards and all that sort of stuff. So the level of finish demanded by them is one thing, and we're trying to keep that as affordable as possible, but obviously comply with what's reasonable. But then we're finding with the boomers who are downsizing, we're finding that they sort of, many of them have come from experiences buying new homes in the outer areas, and they had a smaller project home and then the big move-up project home. Now they're downsizing, and they want all of the finishes, all of the luxuries, all of the storage, and normally project homes don't have much storage in them because they strip all that out because it's extra cost. So the ones we've put on display out there have got all that stuff in them because they're saying this time the kids aren't around and I'm having it. I'm not saving for the school fees because they're out of school, and I'm having the luxurious kitchen with this Caesar top and the wine fridge and all that sort of jazz. So we are seeing the emergence of different groups requiring different standards of finishes and wanting to live in the same size spaces close to amenity, but wanting very different finishes and inclusions.
And the other thing I'm seeing is the divorced families, the children the families that duplicate basically, and they need 2 dwellings for what used to be one family unit is now the mother's family and the father's family, and the children move between, and they've each got their own suite of rooms and their equipment and their media rooms. And again, it's driven by the sort of the perception of the needs of the family driving the built forms. And I think it's going to continue, but I'm very curious to see what's going to happen, and wait on till all these baby boomers start, dying off, and housing will become affordable again.
On that rather macabre note, we
investors,
have a question down the front.
Sorry.
My question's about the durability of the early project homes and the McMansions. I know about the project homes, and a lot of them are being pushed over because they're small and the materials didn't last because they were timber and things. Are the McMansions going to be able to be reworked, or are they built out of ticky-tacky?
I think they'll be able to be reworked. Certainly the finishes, you know, particularly in that early period that I talked about, where there was all that innovation with changing in materials and everything was, particle board with, glues with formaldehydes in it, and there was all of that sort of change of drywall and all those sorts of things. A lot of that stuff hasn't stood the test of time, but I think what's being built now will certainly last, because there's been an enormous amount of consumer backlash to that stuff, and there's Australian standards, and it won't be built like the stuff that's been up for 500 years, but it's certainly better than it was.
So what happens to the 40?
Well, they've got to be renovated, renewed, reworked in some way.
All right, on that note, sorry, did we have one final question, and then we will wrap up.
It's just a comment on the last point that lady was making about what do we do with these old houses. We're in the business of doing that. That's what we do in Sydney. We don't build new houses for people. We spend time fixing up the old houses. And quite often what it is looking at a 40s, or more like a 50s, 60s, 70s house that is small by today's standards. And it's about creating flexibility in the additional spaces, that you're not creating just a man cave, or you're not creating just a media room. You're creating the ability for the house to then move forward with multi-generational families living in them. So, but we're just a very small part of the market in Sydney. We do 2 or 3 projects a year. So that's obviously not going to meet the growing needs of the rest of, the population of Sydney's growth.
Well, a couple of the comments I made right at the end were about that, and I think that's going to be obviously the growth area. And it's interesting, we talk in commercial buildings, like people who specialise in fit-outs and people who specialise in construction. We talk about interior designers with housing, and it's sort of like, picking colours and furnishings. It's not really remodelling the interiors of buildings, and that's going to be a hugely growing area with so much demographic change on the way, and already 1.5 million dwellings in Sydney. So I think it's an area that really needs some thought.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Megan and Mike, please join me in thanking them once more. And of course, a big thanks to all of you for coming along this evening, and for those of you who've been on the journey with us for the last 7 nights or 8 nights now. We thank you for being part of this series. Just quickly, I'd like to thank Claire Wilmot, Jimmy Murray and Mason Dean, who've worked on making sure that the tech and the series and all the rest of it is down. The volunteers who've helped us out, I just said to Terry before, I'm sure he'll be glad to get his Thursday nights back, and he said no, he'd really enjoyed it. And also to Megan and her team in the library who've supported us in doing those fantastic displays that they have set up for a few of the nights that we've had. We have some fantastic events coming up, and the new series for next year will be around iconic houses, 50s, 60s and 70s, so a nice segue there. I didn't plant that lady in the audience. So please, if you're not already in contact with us, make sure that you leave your details with us so that we can keep you appraised of when that is coming up. There are cards for the roll-on event on your chairs if you feel like a Pims and some croquet for a Sunday afternoon. Please join us at Vaucluse House. But I will conclude by saying thank you all very much once more. Have a lovely night, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks.